moments from the ousted president's political career. And we also get reactions here in France to the former Zimbabwean leader's death, and also from regional neighbours South Africa and Tanzania. Also, in other news, we'll be discussing the emergency climate summit that's taking place in Colombia today in the wake of the devastating fires that have ravaged the Amazon rainforest, and efforts to persuade Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, to curb deforestation and free market expansion into the biosphere. We also take a look at this week's Asia-Pacific climate meeting in Bangkok, which is grappling with turning commitments into action on climate change. And we'll be hearing from RFI's Anne-Marie Besada at the Visa pour l'Image Photojournalism Festival taking place in Perpignan. And as always, we'll see what's trending on our website, rfienglish.com. So for all that and more, stay with us here on Paris Live.
Correspondence Call.
Dr. Robert Gabriel Mugabe, the former leader of Zimbabwe, forced to resign in 2017 after a 37-year rule whose early promise as a liberation hero was eroded by economic turmoil and human rights violations, has died in Singapore at the age of 95. His successor, President Emmerson Mnangagwa, confirmed Mugabe's death earlier this Friday, mourning him as an icon of liberation. Now we'll cross live to our correspondent, Ryan Truscott, who's in Harare. Ryan, thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. Now, Zimbabwe has woken up to the news of Robert Mugabe's death today. What's the mood on the streets of Harare today?
Well, David, it's calm. There's no public outpouring of grief as such. It would be very different, of course, had he still been in power. For the last 17 years of his rule, his death was something that journalists always prepared for. There were regular rumors that he had died, and they were always false. Now, today, nearly 2 years since he was ousted, it's finally happened. I don't get the sense, though, that there's the same anger and bitterness against him now as there was when he was in power. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Now, any reaction from the government in Zimbabwe to his death? What exactly has President Mnangagwa said in response to the news that came out this morning?
Well, there's been quite a bit of reaction from all sides of the spectrum. President Mnangagwa, who you remember ousted Mugabe in 2017, has called Mugabe a Pan-Africanist and an icon of liberation who empowered his people. As for the MDC, Nelson Chamisa has said that, yes, his party had differences with Mugabe for years, but Chamisa has today paid his respects. He said that a giant had fallen and that the party recognized Mugabe's contribution as a founding president. So very conciliatory remarks at this stage, even from former opponents. As we're also will be awaiting some sort of statement from the Mugabe family. There's been nothing from them yet. Many will be waiting to hear from Grace Mugabe, Mugabe's much younger wife, and she is, of course, the person many see as the reason he was ousted from power.
Indeed, very magnanimous and, as you said, a conciliatory tone from the Movement for Democratic Change, who indeed suffered grave injustices and suffered rigged elections during Mugabe's rule. But let's look at the generation gap here. I mean, Mugabe was in power for 37 years. For the older generation, he's considered a liberation hero. How will the younger generation view Mugabe's legacy? Will his life be revered or his demise celebrated?
Well, it's very much a mixed legacy. I mean, members of the younger generation have benefited from the positive aspects, the attainment of black majority rule and things like access to education. Even the controversial land reform program, although it's blamed for much of the economic problems here, is seen as a correction of past colonial imbalances. But critics say that negative aspects of Mugabe's legacy do live on, things like the lack of freedom of expression and association, as well as corruption and impunity for those in power. I saw one tweet today from prominent publisher Trevor Nube saying that he's emotionally conflicted because Mugabe was a man who did so much for Zimbabwe and then proceeded to destroy it for the sake of political power.
Do we have any idea of funeral plans? Has anything come out as yet as to what we can expect?
Well, President Mnangagwa has cut short his trip to Cape Town for a World Economic Forum summit. He's now back in Harare and he's due to hold a press conference anytime now at State House. Mugabe, I'm sure, will be declared a national hero, which is a status reserved for icons of the independence war. There'll probably also be several days of national mourning declared. but it's unclear where Mugabe will be buried. Normally, national heroes are buried at a special shrine in Harare, but his family members are said to be gathering today at Zimba, his rural home. So there's also a possibility he'll be buried there.
And just a little aside, Ryan, while we have you on the line, a summit of former liberation guerrilla leaders was due or is due to take place at Victoria Falls this Sunday. Any news on what will become of this summit? Will this now be a platform for adulating Mugabe's legacy as a freedom fighter, not a tyrant? And is it still going ahead?
As far as I know, yes. And of course, this will be a platform for trumpeting his legacy. I mean, across Africa, Mugabe is still revered as a Pan-Africanist and a liberator. He's seen as someone who was fearless in standing up to the West. But it hasn't been lost on people actually living in Zimbabwe that Mugabe died in Singapore, far from the country whose health system he's blamed for ruining. Doctors are on strike here at the moment over low wages. The healthcare system is in tatters. And many of these economic problems that we're experiencing have been blamed on Mugabe's policies. So while outsiders may be vocal in cheering Mugabe's legacy, I think a lot of locals are all too aware of the hardships that he created.
OK, my thanks there to our correspondent Ryan Truscott joining us on the line there from Harare. And indeed, we will be getting reaction from local neighbours in the region, of course, from South Africa and neighbouring Tanzania. And of course, we'll have some reaction to Mugabe's death from here in France. Now, we're going to move straight on now to the life and legacy of Dr. Robert Mugabe, from school teacher to freedom fighter, and some would say executioner, potential war criminal and dictator. We have compiled a testimony of people who knew him and some defining moments from the ousted president's political career. Here's Laura Angela Bagneto.
Father of his country, freedom fighter, liberation ideologue, terrorist, benevolent president, murderer, tyrant. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe wore many hats depending on who you spoke to. But one thing is for certain. He said he would die in office. Instead, he died thousands of miles away in a Singapore hospital.
Go to hell, our people have decided, and that's what matters to us. Is not the right or responsibility of the British to decide on our elections. We don't decide on their own. And why should they poke their pig noses into our...
That's a defiant Mugabe while campaigning in 2002 for the presidential elections. But it would have been at any time during his long reign. Mugabe soured on the international community early on, blaming Western sanctions for food shortages and economic crises that rocked the country. But it didn't start that way. Robert Mugabe was born in white-ruled southern Rhodesia in 1924, the product of strict Jesuit Catholic schooling. Studying and then working as a teacher, he lived in Zambia, South Africa, and then Ghana, where he met his future first wife, Sally, and was inspired by Kwame Nkrumah, the then Prime Minister and Pan-Africanist. Mugabe returned to southern Rhodesia in 1960, still in the shadow of white rule, where dissidence was rewarded with brutality. Mugabe vowed to break the yoke of white domination, entering politics by joining the National Democratic Party, until the party was outlawed by Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith. NDP changed names and became ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, run by Joshua Nkomo. These were formative times. Mugabe spoke of armed struggle. But with rival nationalist groups ZAPU and ZANU at each other's throats, party members were killed on both sides. It came to a head when ZANU members murdered a white farmer. Smith banned both parties in 1964 and imprisoned the leaders, including Mugabe. He was released in 1975. Mugabe, freedom fighter, took over ZANU and turned it into a militant party. And during this time, opponents disappeared. In 1976, Prime Minister Ian Smith said that blacks would never be in power in his famous speech that solidified Zimbabwe's freedom movement.
I don't believe in black majority rule ever in Rhodesia. Not in 1,000 years.
Musician Thomas Mapfumo came out with a response song to Smith's words. Pamuromo Chete, or These Are Mere Words in Shona, was a breakaway hit. The Liberation War continued against white rule throughout the 1970s until the United Kingdom called for a ceasefire to broker the Lancaster House talks in 1979, paving the way for a referendum and the new Republic of Zimbabwe in 1980. Mugabe took the helm in the negotiations, allowing 20 seats in the new parliament for whites and agreeing to a 10-year moratorium on constitutional amendments. He returned to Zimbabwe a hero. Intimidation set the tone of the campaign, but the Shona majority turned out and ensured that Mugabe was elected as the first prime minister of the Republic of Zimbabwe in March 1980, with his ZANU party taking a majority of the parliamentary seats. In a radio address before the inauguration, Mugabe reassured that all Zimbabweans would be united.
Zimbabwe is blessed with a tremendous expansion potential in which we can all share. Let us not ruin it by hasty, ill-conceived actions that in the end benefit no one. The time of retribution is over. Now is the time for reconciliation, reconstruction, and nation building. Let us set aside our differences once and for all and pull together. And I assure you the prize is great. Long live our freedom.
In April 1980, Mugabe was sworn in as Prime Minister of a free Zimbabwe. The late Wilson Katio was a self-exiled Zimbabwean writer, author of the acclaimed book, Son of the Soil. He spoke to RFI at the time about attending the inauguration.
It was very exciting to come back to my country after 15 years of living outside the country. I mean, being here on Independence Day in 1980 was electric. It will never happen again. It's a one-off experience. I mean, the country became independent only one day. And that whole experience was just amazing, you know, the people's emotions, very powerful. I'd like to write about that.
Part of the healing was also extending a hand to Joshua Nkomo and his rival party, ZAPU. John Stewart, a Zimbabwean human rights activist, said,
resentments didn't die. He couldn't overcome them. So I think the resentments about the Ndebele and the sense of feeling Joshua Nkomo was trying to outdo him in the early 80s led him to overreact with the whole presence of the 5th Brigade in Matabeleland.
They named this Gikuruhundi, a Shona term for the early rain which washes away the chaff before the spring rains, considered a genocide by some. Mugabe later said this was a mistake, but he never apologized. In 1987, Mugabe abolished the prime minister position and became president of Zimbabwe. This followed with re-elections in 1990 and 1996. Mapfumo, who created Chimurenga music, or struggle, in Shona, became disillusioned with the Mugabe regime, along with others throughout Zimbabwe. He brought out the album Corruption in 1989, an overt critique of Mugabe. After government harassment, he went into exile in the U.S.
Watch out, my friend. They're gonna get you. You gonna run away from justice. ADH of freedom.
The 1990s turned public opinion against Robert Mugabe. John Stewart, a Zimbabwean freedom fighter, said his problems truly started when his first wife, Sally, died.
He then, I think, rather lost his way. She was an equal to him, quite unlike his second wife, Grace. And so she would challenge him and discuss issues with him, and there was something of an intellectual debate there, and that meant that he at home had some kind of stability.
He would go on to marry Grace 4 years later in 1996. Grace was known for her huge shopping expeditions overseas and the dairies she confiscated from white farmers, rather than political acumen. Although once touted as the symbol of the African independence struggle, Mugabe's reputation began to wane with land and economic scandals, and the long walk to freedom of another freedom fighter. John Stewart.
Mugabe had been an icon of Southern Africa until Mandela was free. So in some ways, I think Mugabe resented the loss of status from when Mandela came into the picture.
One of the most polarizing issues in Zimbabwe was land reform. When signing the Lancaster House Agreement, Mugabe accepted the, quote, willing buyer, willing seller plan, unquote, proposed by the UK. This would protect white farmers who legally owned 70% of the best farming land. Mugabe had foreshadowed the problems to come in an August 1982 speech about kicking whites off farms.
Those who think Ian Smith can rally the white folk and rally them for another war should think again when there is still time for them to do so. We say here on this national shrine that the game is up and it is time for them to go where they belong.
Many white farmers packed up and left. Mugabe used land as a stick after a government-sponsored draft constitution was defeated in a referendum in the year 2000. Wolf Mbenga, founder and editor of the Zimbabwean newspaper, was declared an enemy of the people. He speaks of the land issue from his office in the UK.
He had to come up with this gimmick, the land question, because most people in Zimbabwe love to own a piece of land. And he came and said, everybody, we're going to just take this land, we're not paying for it, we're going to give it to the people. He thought it would win him votes, but he still didn't. People saw through it, that it was not a genuine attempt to transfer land to the landless poor. But the people who benefited even to this day were people in the army, the judges, the police. They've become the landed gentry in our country.
Thousands of ZANU-PF self-styled war veterans illegally took over commercial farms. Farmers who didn't volunteer their farms were tortured and some were killed. Robert Mugabe.
The fact that the papers in Britain all expected me to order the war veterans out, I said I will not do that at all.
The way Mugabe had handled the land issue led to Zimbabwe losing its position in Africa as the farming center of the continent. Those kicked off their lands were commercial farmers, and the war veterans who took them over were not farmers with no expertise on creating a commercially viable enterprise. This contributed to a big food shortage in 2002, bordering on famine. Wolf Mbenga.
The majority of Zimbabweans today are poorer than they were in 1953. Mugabe has reduced that nation from the breadbasket of Southern Africa into a begging bowl. Today, Zimbabwe can't feed itself, and yet we used to feed our neighbors.
International donors cut aid after Mugabe's land seizure program, and they threatened sanctions. Mugabe was undeterred.
We will proceed with current land reform with or without sanctions. Let that position be known here and abroad.
Parliament passed a law in 2002 quashing press freedom. The European Union imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. Mugabe was faced with a growing opposition. The Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, gained ground in the 2000 parliamentary polls. By 2005, Mugabe's ZANU-PF won 2/3 of the votes in the parliamentary polls, while MDC, under the leadership of Morgan Tsvangirai, said the election was rigged. Mugabe refused to bow to international pressure to speak with the MDC. At Heroes' Day celebrations in August 2005, where the country honored Zimbabwean freedom fighters, Mugabe said that the MDC was leaning too much on outside influences.
I am aware that there are shrill calls from many quarters, including those which we expect to know better, for the so-called talks with the MDC. Some of these calls have been motivated by the MDC leadership, which wrongly thinks it can use international pressure to compel us to talk to it.
The MDC had captured the interest of the urban poor in Harare, the capital, and in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe's second city. Some believe Mugabe was politically motivated when he bulldozed shanties in 2005 in Operation Murambatsvina, or Operation Throw Out the Rubbish. The UN said more than 700,000 people lost their homes or their livelihoods. Many of those had voted MDC in the last election. Daily life in Zimbabwe was soon to get worse. In May 2006, inflation exceeded 1,000%. Zimbabweans became billionaires overnight, but didn't have enough money to buy food. Electricity cuts gripped the country. By the 2008 parliamentary elections, however, opposition MDC party had solidified its power base. 2 months after elections, Morgan Tsvangirai, the head of the MDC, had won more votes than Mugabe, but not enough to avoid a runoff. MDC voters were attacked in the days leading up to the runoff, prompting Tsvangirai to pull out. He explained why.
Our decision to pull out of this sham election was in the best interest of the people of Zimbabwe. Any election conducted arrogantly, unilaterally on Friday will not be recognized by the MDC, by Zimbabweans, and by the world over.
Mugabe was declared the winner in June, and the EU and US widened sanctions against Mugabe and his cronies. At this point, Mugabe was faced with a power-sharing government with his rivals MDC. Amidst fighting over which party gets what portfolio, the country declared a national emergency over a cholera epidemic. In an effort to stem the economic crisis affecting every Zimbabwean, the government allowed the use of foreign currency, specifically the US dollar. The strained coalition government held together until 2013, when presidential and parliamentary elections were held. Although there was talk that Mugabe should retire as he approached 90, he dismissed all calls to step down. As in previous elections, fraud undermined the polls. Voter roll registration fraud prevented urban MDC supporters to vote, strengthening Mugabe and ZANU-PF's hold on the rural rest of the country. In a rare press conference the night before elections, Mugabe claimed he would be a gracious loser.
If you go into a process and join in a competition where there are only two outcomes, you either win or you lose. If you lose, then you must surrender to those who have won. And this is it. We'll do so, yes.
Mugabe was declared the winner for a seventh term. While in office, he began making some major changes to his ZANU-PF party. Longtime Mugabe stalwart Emmerson Mnangagwa was kicked out of his vice president position and fled the country on November 6, 2017. He returned 16 days later with the backing of the military. Mugabe forced to resign in a bloodless coup d'etat. Angry, but with his age showing, he called for a press conference during the 2018 elections, the first time his name would not be on a Zimbabwe presidential ballot. He claimed he would not vote for the party he formed, ZANU-PF, and namely for Mnangagwa. He said he would vote for Nelson Chamisa, MDC candidate.
I cannot vote for those who have tormented me. No, I can't. I'll make my choice among the other 22. What is there? I think it's just Chamisa.
Defeated, tired, and in declining health, Mugabe checked into a hospital in Singapore, where he died on September 6, 2019, age 95.
And that report compiled there by RFI's Laura Angela Bagnato. Now I'm joined by RFI's Michael Fitzpatrick for a look at what the French daily newspapers are saying about the man who presided over Zimbabwe for the first 37 years of black majority rule. So, Michael, what are they saying?
Well, Dave, the French papers, whatever their political divisions on local questions, are unanimous in their assessment of Robert Mugabe. He was, by all accounts, a hero who lost his way. Mugabe went from being a stalwart in the fight for his nation's independence and a courageous supporter of the anti-apartheid struggle in southern Africa, only to become a hatefully despotic dictator who ruined Zimbabwe's economy.
So, Michael, give us a flavour of what the Paris papers are saying about his legacy.
The headline in right-wing Le Figaro is strictly informative. The former president of Zimbabwe is dead. But the neutral tone quickly changes. Mugabe turned into an autocrat, says the Le Figaro obituary. His long reign as president plunged his country into violence and misery. Le Monde notes the personal tragedy of this solitary death in a hospital in faraway Singapore. The centrist paper points out, echoing our correspondent Ryan Truscott a few moments ago, that it was in fact Robert Mugabe's mismanagement which is largely to blame for the fact that Zimbabwe itself has no hospital in which the former leader could have been treated.
So what about the socialist and communist commentary, should I say, in the press?
Well, left-leaning Libération notes the young leader's enthusiastic promotion of education and his contradictory failure to understand that those very reforms were providing the weapons that a generation who looked to the future rather than the glorious victories of the past would use against him. He met their lucidity with ferocity, and when violence didn't work, Mugabe built walls of corruption, nepotism and injustice, according to Libé. Catholic daily La Croix says Mugabe's greatest error was to promote his young and ambitious wife Grace as a potential successor. That cost him the support of the army, the ruling party and the street. And perhaps significantly, Communist daily L'Humanité makes no mention whatsoever of the departure of the man they once called Comrade Bob, times change.
Well, is it reasonable to reduce a long life, however controversial, to a headline and a couple of paragraphs of text? Yeah?
Obviously not. History will take its time to make a final and definitive decision on this man, but most commentators recognise that Mugabe's personality was far more complex than that of what Le Figaro wonderfully calls the average African tyrant. A nice concept, that. More complex, of course, doesn't necessarily mean any better. The first president of the new black-ruled nation preached forgiveness and reconciliation, even allowing his former jailer, the president Ian Smith, to lead the parliamentary opposition and then retire to end his days, that's Smith's days, on a farm which the state never attempted to reappropriate. But I'm afraid reconciliation didn't extend to Joshua Nkomo, as we've already heard, Mugabe's fellow fighter for independence, nor to Nkomo's Ndebele ethnic group, as many as 20,000 of whom lost their lives in the radical resolution of what was basically a political problem. The world, of course, was looking the other way. But when the economy got bogged down in the late 90s because of corruption and political prevarication, Mugabe chose to forget what white farmers had done to make Zimbabwe the grain store of southern Africa. To distract attention from astronomical inflation, he unleashed hordes of so-called ex-combatants from the independence struggle on the farmers, further plunged the nation into economic chaos, and earned Mugabe himself the status of an international pariah.
OK, and just briefly now, Michael, what about across the channel in the UK? They're perhaps only too happy to get a break from Boris Johnson these days.
Well, the Times in London speaks of the liberator who became an oppressor. The Guardian calls Mugabe Africa's fallen angel. The tabloid Sun, with typical delicacy and nuance, announces the death of a tyrant, saying Robert Mugabe's reign of terror crippled his country. And the Daily Mail has already moved on with possibly the longest obituary headline in history. It reads, and I quote, "Will Gucci Grace Mugabe now be prosecuted? Dictator's widow faces arrest for stealing Zimbabwe's wealth and sharing it with her playboy sons after the death of her husband and protector."
Insightful stuff there from the Daily Mail as ever. OK, my thanks there to Michael Fitzpatrick for that look at what the French papers and, of course, what they're saying across the water here, there, shall I say, in the UK, are saying about the demise of the late Robert Mugabe.
Correspondence Call.
Now, regional neighbours of Robert Mugabe and Zimbabwe have been effusive in their praise for the 95-year-old former president who died in Singapore. They were as relieved as Zimbabweans themselves when 2 years ago he was ousted by the very army that had kept him in power for 37 years. Now we can cross to our correspondent Jean-Jacques Cornish, who's in Pretoria. Jean-Jacques, thanks for taking our call today. It would be rude not to get in touch with the biggest neighbour down below Zimbabwe with so many ties there. High praise, should I say, from neighbouring presidents on the continent. But what are other politicians who dealt with Mugabe saying about him today?
Well, we had Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, and Hage Geingob, the Namibian president, both talking about his liberation credentials and saying that he had actually inspired them and made them realize, or made South Africa and Namibia realize, that they too could throw colonialism overboard and become free. But somebody like former minister in the Foreign Office, Lord Peter Hain, who was a South African educated political activist and anti-apartheid activist, he's saying that Robert Mugabe was a classic case of a liberator who betrayed the very values of democracy, human rights and social justice that he had championed, and saying that history will treat Robert Mugabe very harshly indeed.
Now, Jean-Jacques, you were among the first South African journalists to interview Mugabe 43 years ago, and you have spoken to him several times since then. And what were your impressions of the man?
Well, I met him in 1976. I was a correspondent to the United Nations. I was the first South African journalist allowed back into Mozambique after the revolution. There was this conference, and he impressed me enormously. Quiet spoken man, and he said that we have to avoid making the same mistakes that the Portuguese made. I mean, that the Mozambicans made, and that was kicking out white entrepreneurs and white farmers. And he spoke about reconciliation. Well, I then covered Lancaster House a few years later, and he there, of course, took the approach that he didn't have to be there because power was waiting for him. And, of course, he did get a landslide victory. Now, many times I was invited to State House to talk about Lancaster House. He loved to talk about those days. He used to sit there and say, "Are you afraid of my lions?" He had 2 mangy stuffed lions on his veranda. And when I said, "Not really, Mr. President," he'd say, "Well, you don't have to be." But he then, he was a man, of course, who a very complex individual and bright and very likable at first. But once he became a despot, effectively, and he was corrupted by what happened. You know, he turned Zimbabwe, the breadbasket of the region, into the basket case of the region with these land grabs and economic mismanagement. That what I have in front of me, banknote for $200 trillion, which would not have bought me a loaf of bread at the height of the worst part of in Zimbabwe. So, you know, I have mixed feelings about the man. And as I say, he invited me to State House, but he didn't hesitate to have his people arrest me and then throw me out when I went to try to cover, without proper credentials, the election that we all believed he had lost to Morgan Tsvangirai.
Okay, Jean-Jacques, thank you very much for sharing those experiences that you had personally there with Robert Mugabe over the course of the last 40 plus years. My thanks again to Jean-Jacques Cornish.
Correspondence Call. Moja kwa moja kutoka Dar es Salaam, RFI Kiswahili.
Now, Tanzanians have joined the rest of Africa in mourning the death of former Zimbabwe President Robert Mugabe. And during the liberation struggle, Tanzania was the hiding place and refuge for Mugabe's freedom fighters. Now, for more on how Mugabe was viewed in Tanzania and how Tanzania contributed to him coming to power, we have RFI Kiswahili's Emmanuel Makundi joining us from our studios in Dar es Salaam. Habari za jioni Makundi, umekaribu sana.
Asante sana David, habari za pari.
Salama kabisa bwana. Now, how is Robert Mugabe viewed today in Tanzania?
Well, thank you, David. Many viewed him as a true leader who wanted good things to his people, a revolutionary leader, a true Pan-Africanist, and an icon for the African continent during and after independence of many African countries. For them, Tanzanians, he was a true friend to Tanzania and had a close relationship with the late first president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who gave refuge to thousands of his freedom fighters during the struggle for independence in Zimbabwe. And many are saying that they have lost one of the greatest leaders that Africa has ever had, and Tanzania has ever had as a friend.
So exactly what role did Tanzania play during his independence struggle? And how special, indeed, was Tanzania to Mugabe personally?
Well, Tanzania played a great role in making sure Mugabe liberation struggle becomes a reality. Mwalimu Nyerere by then gave refuge and provided training camps for his soldiers in Tanzania. Also, Nyerere provided travel documents for him and his soldiers to go abroad to receive more training, like in China, Russia, Algeria, and Egypt. Tanzania also helped Mugabe to establish some of the strong institutions, police and army. And since then, Mugabe was always close to late Mwalimu Nyerere and the country. So he held a very special place in Tanzania, and since then, the friendship have grown stronger, and several times Mugabe and Mwalimu Nyerere met to discuss some issues, and also the former president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, Jakaya Kikwete, and also Benjamin Mkapa met several times with Mugabe and discussed the relationship between Tanzania and Zimbabwe.
So indeed, Mugabe will always remain an independence icon for Tanzanians and not the fallen dictator that other people from around the planet may look at him as. So it's very interesting as we go through our program today, the mixed feelings across the board, but also, how he has been lauded for his initial work to freeing Zimbabwe and, of course, the fall from grace in the last 20 years of his reign, if you will. For that insight into how Tanzanians view and have viewed the the rise and fall of Robert Mugabe. My thanks there to Emmanuel Makundi, mwandishi wa habari kutoka Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Well, you're listening to Paris Live here on Radio France International with me, David Coffey, and you're very welcome to the programme if you've just joined us. Well, moving away from the death of Robert Mugabe, we're coming up later in the programme. We're going to look at the climate summit now that is being taking place in Colombia today. It's an emergency summit being called in the wake of those devastating fires that have ravaged the Amazon rainforest. We also take a look at Asia Pacific climate meeting that took place in Bangkok this week, which grappled with turning commitment into action on climate change. And also we'll be hearing from RFI's Anne-Marie Besada from the Visa pour l'Image Photojournalism Festival that's taking place in Perpignan. And towards the end of the programme, we'll have a look at what's trending on our website, rfienglish.com, with our web editor today. That's Christina Okello. And Mugabe aside, we will be taking a look at what else is coming to our attention here at rfienglish.com this afternoon.
In Focus.
Now, an emergency summit to protect the Amazon rainforest is taking place today in Leticia in Colombia, with leaders of the South American countries affected by the raging forest fires in the Amazon. After saying he wouldn't attend for medical reasons, Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, is going to take part in the discussions through a video call. Dr. Hervé Terry is a French geographer who works for the CNRS, or French National Scientific Research Centre. He also teaches at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil and has lived in the country for 10 years. RFI's Cleo Lahita asked him why the leaders of the countries where the Amazon is burning have taken so long to gather and act to stop the fires.
I think for them it's a normal thing. There is no much matter in cutting and burning. This year it has been different because in Europe, in North America, and also in Russia, there have been a lot of accidental fire. So the public opinion has been touchy and paying attention to fires. The only difference is that in Brazil this year it's much more. There are much more fires than the year before, because a new leader, newly elected leader, has practically stopped any policy of repression of fire and protection of the environment. He has also encouraged people to burn more. That was attracting attention, and also the dramatization brought by Emmanuel Macron at the G7 in Biarritz brought a lot of attention. But most of the other countries are doing business as usual. It's a strange situation. Most of it is done to pay attention, to give a little attention to public opinion, not much more than that.
And you said earlier that there was a lot of media attention on the fires. What is your reaction to the way the media has handled the subject of the fires?
Well, in the beginning of August, everybody was seemed to have thought that it was the same as in France, as in Spain, as in Siberia, accidental fires. So the first interview I gave, myself and several other people, of course, have to explain, no, it's not accidental, it's voluntary. So I think a little progress has been made in order to understand better what's happening. But it's quite normal. It's everyone thinks in terms of his experience, her experience. So it's quite different in the Amazon. Everything is different. The scale is different. The Amazon, Brazilian Amazon only, is bigger than Europe. And so there are different situations. And the 8 other countries which have part of it could also have very different situations. So it's a bit difficult to understand.
Okay, so you feel like the media has kind of overplayed the situation?
At the beginning, maybe, but everything which can take into account that kind of situation is good. So much for the era, and that's a good thing in the end.
You've written several books about Brazil, but as a geographer, where does the Amazon forest fit into your work?
Well, my thesis was on Amazonia. They did exactly in the region which is burning much more than the others at the moment, Rondônia. So it's very sensible for me. When I did my thesis there was 100,000 people. Now it's 1.5 million, and it was only one road open in the middle, and now 40% of that region, which is about half of France or more or less the area of Great Britain is 40% has gone. So it's something I've been observing for the last 40 years, so it's a bit important for me. And also I've been part of a scientific committee of the G7 program, which has been set up in the 90s to save the Amazon forest already. This program was very interesting. It lasted for 12 years and had done a lot of good for the Amazon with $150 million. So it's much bigger than what is sold now. And it helped a lot, in instance, for the Amazon, the Indian reserves, which have been set up through that program with European G7 money. So it's something I've been looking for. It makes me a lot old, but my first book in the 80s, 82, was called Le pillage de l'Amazonie, the plundering of Amazon. The preoccupation for the Amazon has not started today, it's already a long time.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that was Dr. Hervé Théry from the CNRS, French Scientific Research Centre, speaking there to Cléo Lahit. Well, turning commitments into action is the bold ambition of this week's Asia-Pacific climate meeting in Bangkok, which is grappling with the full gamut of issues raised by the climate emergency. With the impact of climate change becoming increasingly costly for the region, the Asia-Pacific Climate Week offers a chance to pressure governments over their plans for dirty energy and turn them towards climate-friendly solutions. Now, NGOs in the Asia-Pacific are calling on leaders to stop building new coal power plants from 2020, to stop subsidizing fossil fuels, and to introduce a carbon tax. One of the event's organisers is the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP. Its Deputy Executive Secretary, Kaved Zahedi, told RFI's Amanda Morrow the Asia-Pacific remains very attached to coal, which could jeopardise the Paris Climate Accord.
About 40% of the total energy supply in Asia-Pacific right now is from coal. But more than current installed capacity, about 80% of the global coal power capacity under construction is also in our region, in China, in India, in Southeast Asia. And certainly some of the plans that we see coming up in countries like Australia, all of these are, of course, incompatible with the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, to say the least, and they will lock these countries into high pollution energy for decades to come.
How much talk is there of solutions such as carbon pricing and a climate income, making people pay for their own carbon footprint and steering countries towards a circular economy?
Oh, very much. One of our sessions is specifically around carbon pricing and markets. In fact, the genesis of these climate weeks that you have in all regions was the previous carbon forums, which were more a gathering of private sector looking at exactly the issues you mentioned about carbon pricing and the emerging markets for that. But clearly, putting a price on carbon is going to have to be part of the solution. And we see pockets of it around our region, but it's nowhere nearly as prevalent as it would need to be to sort of steer the economy in a different direction. So yes, is there talk of it? Absolutely, there's talk of it. Is there enough action on it? Probably not yet.
Right. Now, as you say, regional climate weeks such as this, they're feeding this year into the UN Climate Summer later this month. Pacific Island nations who are at the forefront of climate change, they won't be delivering the message that they were hoping for after their regional climate declaration was watered down essentially by Australia at the Pacific Island Forum. I'm just wondering, will there be a resounding message to come from the Asia-Pacific Climate Week?
Well, you mentioned the Pacific. I think there is a resounding message, whether it comes through a declaration from the Leaders' Summit or not. We've seen extraordinary leadership from the Pacific Islands and extraordinary clarity on what is needed. I think that really almost the global moral leadership on climate change is taken up by Pacific Island states. And it's not a surprise. They are, as you say, on the front line, especially the low atoll countries like the Marshall Islands. It's existential. They're already feeling the impacts of it. And of course, they are advocating for the fastest action. They are the strongest advocates for moving towards 1.5 and not 2 degrees etc. So I think the message from certainly the Pacific is crystal clear. Whether there is an Asia-Pacific message as a whole, I'm not so sure. But that's one of the purposes of our Climate Week. You know, it's sort of the appetizer for the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, where he clearly called for countries to come with scaled up ambition, including, as I said, no more new coal-fired power stations, including plans for peaking their emissions this decade and decarbonization by the middle of the century, as well as some of the adaptation plans and the resilience plans through risk insurance, through early warning systems, etc.
Now, this week's event in Bangkok opened against a backdrop of damaging floods in northern Thailand following a tropical cyclone. There was, of course, the recent UN report explaining how the region's experiencing more intense, more frequent disasters. I imagine that this cyclone has lent urgency to the event. How much focus is there on the impacts of climate change and how to deal with these sorts of disasters?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the countries of Asia-Pacific have no choice. They have to deal with, exactly as you say, more frequent, more intense, more unpredictable disasters. Of course, it includes Thailand, but goes well beyond. The region as a whole, just like the globe, the past 5 years have been the hottest on record, and we've seen intense heat waves, and we see increased drought becoming much more frequent. You mentioned the case of Thailand. Thailand, actually, the rainy season was unusual as well. The reservoirs are at a low, and now this is coupled with a different weather system. So this kind of unusual tropical cyclones that are originating beyond their traditional risk zone, all of this is leading almost to a situation where every event is called unprecedented. Unprecedented floods in Iran earlier this year, unprecedented floods in India's Kerala state, unprecedented floods and heat waves in quick succession in Japan and in South Asia, record temperatures. This is the region's new climate reality. And of course, the region has to build resilience and adapt to this reality.
And that was the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, Kaveh Zahedi, speaking there to RFI's Amanda Morrow from Bangkok.
In France today.
Now, what makes a person grab a camera and set off into the middle of a conflict to take photos? Is it the adrenaline rush? Is it the notoriety of snapping the best photo? Or is it simply the strong need to tell the story of those caught in the middle of the fight? Alain Keeler has been a photojournalist for over 50 years, but he's careful to consider himself a photographer and not a war reporter. But he has covered a range of conflicts over the years, from the Ethiopian Civil War in the 1970s to the Bosnian War in the 1990s. While taking photos for news agencies, he always carried around a small Leica camera with a 35mm or 50mm lens. He snapped photos that were just for him, and he removed from the gore or the fight. And those photos are what make up his current photo exhibition at the Visa pour l'Image Festival, currently taking place in Perpignan. RFI's Anne-Marie Bassada caught up with him at the festival and began by asking what drove him to decide to become a photographer.
When I was very young, my parents were fantastic people, but they didn't get along. So they used to scream at each other. And I think as a kid, that was probably very annoying. And I was extremely good in geography, because geography means going away, traveling, different countries, and I was listening on the shortwave, on the radio, foreign programs, the Chinese speaking French, Russian speaking French, etc. And that was fascinating. It was already the start of a trip. It was very intriguing. You see, like voices coming from outer space. So as soon as I could travel, I bought a little camera, then I traveled with a backpack and blah, blah, blah. And altogether, at one point, I worked for 1 year in a publishing house in Paris in the dark room, and with the money I bought 2 cameras and I decided to travel around the world. I didn't mean to become a photographer yet, but I wanted to photograph because for me it was really an important way of showing the world, and as I was very shy, a way to get near the people, because maybe I couldn't speak to the people, and you go across the world in many different countries where you cannot speak, obviously, to people you don't know the language. But the camera, for me, was this way of opening up to these people. I started photojournalism gradually when I traveled in Latin America, and I started covering the first year of the military coup in Chile, etc., etc. I got involved with Sigma, and that was a very big beginning. But you see, it was a slow process, a very slow process, and it worked.
Covering conflicts and stuff, was that intuitive for you as to, in the middle of the conflict, what do you look for? What is it you're saying that's a good photo, and you're trying to stay alive as well?
Human interest of pictures. I like the people, and I'm taking basically pictures of people in whatever kind of situation, but I think the people in the middle of the conflict are the one that we are relating to. You know, when you have someone being killed or someone crying, etc., it's a way to show that the situation for these people is absolutely terrible.
Having covered so many of these conflicts, did it ever affect you personally, that it was a bit traumatic, that coming back to a family life, it's a bit hard for you?
Well, one thing is I was probably, like other photographers, sometimes hiding behind my camera. Then after, effectively after, when you look at your contact sheet, when you look at the picture, it makes you something. But I knew that I had to show the pictures, even if it was a difficult situation. In some of the conflict or the places where I went, I felt absolutely terrible for these people, and I had to not take part of it because I'm not an activist, but I had to relay the feeling I had about this terrible situation, and photography helped me.
Do you think that the popularity of social media, in particular Instagram and the advent of selfies and all of this, you just kind of rolled your eyes now, but what do you think that has done to photography? Because everyone is a photographer now, in essence.
Yes, I just don't know what to say. Instagram is very bad, I think. It's very easy, it's fun. You can show pictures of your friends, of your girlfriend, of your cousin, of your parents. Some people use Instagram. They're not photographers, but they have followers because they have a way of taking pictures or whatever. I was in Instagram for a while, and then I stopped putting pictures because I found that it is not very, very serious. It's becoming a commercial venture with some photographers or pseudo-photographer having 20,000 followers, 50,000 followers. This is completely unrealistic. I really don't like that. It doesn't mean that everything should be thrown away. I mean, if you do something serious, like when I started my blog and I put it also on Facebook, it can be a way to show your work as long as it's interesting work. So I would say, okay, if you want to have fun, you go to Instagram. If you want to make things serious, just take pictures and try to show them another way.
And that was photojournalist Alain Keller speaking there to RFI's Anne-Marie Besada at the Visa pour l'Image, taking place currently in Perpignan.
Why are there protests in Hong Kong every year on the 1st of July? Listen to the Sound Kitchen podcast this Saturday, see if you're one of the lucky winners, and tease your brain with a new quiz question. That's the Sound Kitchen podcast, ready for you every Saturday on the RFI English website, rfienglish.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And indeed, we all look forward to listening to the one and only Susan Owensby and that podcast, The Sound Kitchen, that drops this weekend. You're listening to Paris Live. It's time now for a look at the rest of today's headlines and what else is making news on RFIEnglish.com today. And I'm joined in the studio by RFI's web editor today, and that's Christina Okello.
Hi, David.
So what is coming up? What can we see? I mean, obviously we've been dominated by the death of Robert
yes,
Mugabe.
Of course,
indeed.
but elsewhere in the world, French far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon has been meeting with Brazil's former president Lula da Silva in jail. Mélenchon is currently touring Latin America. He went to Brazil Brazil to show his support for Lula, the former president, whom he argues is innocent. Lula, a popular left leader, is serving a 12-year sentence for taking bribes, but the judge who put him behind bars is currently being accused of bias, and he's now the current Justice Minister of President Jair Bolsonaro.
And what did the pair discuss?
Well, first, Lula began by showing off his treadmill, which he trains on 2 hours per day. Mélenchon said he walked away from the meeting feeling very revived and rejuvenated from the 74-year-old's energy. And then they discussed their legal warfare, as they call it, attempts by politicians in both their countries to silence them through legal means. And Mélenchon, of course, is also being investigated for corruption here in Paris. He's going to be in court next week. Mélenchon accused Bolsonaro of being worse than Stalin, whom he said at least had the decency to wait for a confession before locking up his opponents.
Strong words indeed.
Yes.
Now, speaking of legal woes, Cameroon's opposition leader Maurice Kamto is appearing in a military court today.
Yes, that's right. Kamto arrived in court this Friday, surrounded by 200 police officers in anti-riot gear, while others patrolled the area in pickup trucks. Security was tight amid calls from Kamto's followers to protest outside the court. Kamto, together with several dozen of his political allies and supporters, is facing charges of insurrection, hostility to the motherland and rebellion, crimes which, in theory at least, could carry the death penalty. The head of the opposition movement for the rebirth of Cameroon, the MRC, was arrested in late January of this year after months of peaceful opposition protests denouncing the results of last year's presidential election. Earlier this week, just days ahead of their trial, Kamto and his fellow defendants said they were ready to face justice so the truth would finally come out. Well, we'll have to wait and see if it will, David.
Indeed. And finally, Christina, turbulent times for France's second largest air company, Aigle d'Azur.
Yes, that's right. As of today, the cash-strapped airliner will no longer be flying and has had to cancel nearly all of its flights. The company, which flies mainly to Algeria, has maintained only 44 flights to Algiers, but has urged all other passengers to check with their insurance company for a possible refund. The news doesn't come as a complete surprise. Aigle d'Azur filed for bankruptcy on Monday.
And its economic woes sadly have left thousands stranded, of course. What's going to happen to those passengers, and how are they meant to get back to their debt?
Well, Aigle d'Azur is desperately looking for a knight in shining armour, essentially a new buyer to take on the airline and its 1,000 or so employees, including some 350 based in Algeria. So, David, if you have some cash lying around and are feeling generous, perhaps you could play hero for the day.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I have many friends in Aer Lingus, or God, Norwegian Airlines are suffering a similar fate as well with trying to open their transatlantic routes via Ireland. Indeed. My thanks there to Christina O'Callaghan there for looking at, for telling us what else is moving on our website, rfienglish.com. Well, now we're coming to the weekend. We're going to leave you with a little bit of music now to bring you up to the end of our programme. This is Pat Thomas and the Kwashibu Area Band and Into Boise. And of course, these guys are from Ghana. You're listening there to a little bit of Pat Thomas and the Kwashibu Area Band, bringing you up to the top of the hour here on Paris Live. Look, we're going to leave you for now. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
can follow RFI English on Facebook and Twitter, and email us at parislive@rfi.fr.